A Navy SEAL chief named James Watson walked point through the Mekong Delta with a weapon he called Sweetheart. It weighed 6 pounds, held 8 shells, and had a steel attachment on the muzzle that turned buckshot into a horizontal wall of lead 5 feet high and 12 feet wide. He could empty all 8 rounds in under 2 seconds without releasing the trigger. The Viet Cong who encountered Watson and his modified Ithaca 37 shotgun had a very short window to react. Watson would later write, with the dark humor common among SEALs, that he heard no complaints from any of them. But Watson's customized weapon was just one example of a shotgun that became the most feared close-quarters firearm in Vietnam. This is the story of the Ithaca Model 37, the men who carried it, and why a pump-action shotgun, designed in 1937, became the weapon of choice for point men, tunnel rats, and special operators in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The Ithaca Model 37 began its military service with a lie that persisted throughout the entire Vietnam War. An officer confronted Chief Watson about his shotgun. The exchange went exactly like this. "Sir, do you realize that shotguns are against the Geneva Convention?" Watson's response captured the institutional confusion perfectly. "Colonel, if they ever send me to Geneva, I'll leave her at home, but between now and then, she and I just don't part company." The officer was wrong. Shotguns were not prohibited by the Geneva Convention. The confusion dated back to World War I, when Germany had filed a formal protest claiming the Winchester Model 1897 trench gun violated international law. The U.S. Judge Advocate General's office had thoroughly rejected that argument. But the myth survived into Vietnam, creating an unspoken tension around a weapon that units kept requesting and the military kept issuing. The numbers tell the story of that contradiction. The United States shipped nearly 100,000 shotguns to Southeast Asia during the war, but the shotgun never became general issue. It remained a select issue weapon, typically one per squad, carried by specific men in specific roles. The Ithaca 37 was the second most numerous new production combat shotgun of the war. Roughly 22,000 S-Pref Ithaca riot guns were manufactured under the original 1962 Army contract, with additional smaller orders for SEAL-modified variants. The Stevens Model 77E was more numerous, with over 60,000 manufactured, but the Stevens cost just $33.51 per unit, and most went to South Vietnamese forces. The Ithaca cost $38.11. The Remington 870 cost $55.43. Therefore, the Ithaca represented the middle choice. More refined than the budget Stevens, more affordable than the premium Remington, and equipped with features that neither competitor could match. But what made a pump-action shotgun worth carrying in Vietnam? The answer lies in 3 specific design features and the combat geometry of jungle warfare. The first feature that separated the Ithaca 37 from every other shotgun in Vietnam was something it deliberately lacked: a trigger disconnector. In a modern pump shotgun, the trigger disconnector is a small mechanism that forces the shooter to release and re-pull the trigger between each shot. It's a safety feature that prevents the gun from firing during the pump stroke. The Ithaca 37 didn't have one. This was not a malfunction or a field modification. It was an inherent feature of the gun's original design, descended from John Browning's 1915 Remington Model 17 patent. Instead of a trigger disconnector, the Ithaca used what's called a secondary sear system. A small stud on the hammer engaged a notch on the slide release, holding the hammer cocked during the pump stroke. The instant the bolt traveled forward and locked into battery, the secondary sear tripped automatically, dropping the hammer onto the firing pin. The practical effect was straightforward and devastating. A shooter fired the first round normally, then he kept the trigger fully depressed. Each subsequent pump stroke produced an immediate shot the instant the bolt locked. Pull back to eject and cock. Push forward to chamber, fire, pull back, push forward, fire. A trained operator could empty a full magazine of 5 rounds in under 2 seconds, producing a cyclic rate approaching 150 to 200 rounds per minute in short bursts. The technique had a name: slam fire. Exhibition shooter Herb Parsons famously used a Winchester Model 12's identical slam fire capability to break 7 hand-thrown clay targets before they hit the ground. His description of the technique was pure simplicity. "I just held back the trigger and pumped like hell." But there was a trade-off. With the trigger pinned back, the shooter could not employ the push-pull recoil management technique that makes aimed pump gun fire effective. Each successive blast drove the muzzle upward. SEAL historian Kevin Dockery noted that experienced combat operators viewed slam fire with nuance. Among SEALs, the technique was considered a great way to waste ammunition and not hit anything. Most trained shooters developed conventional rapid-fire skills until the trigger reset became unconscious muscle memory. Therefore, in most combat situations, slam fire was the wrong technique. But in the specific combat geometry of Vietnam, there were situations where accuracy mattered far less than volume of fire in the first 2 seconds of contact. If you served in Vietnam and carried a shotgun, leave a comment below about what you carried and why. Your stories are part of the historical record. To understand why the Ithaca 37's slam fire capability mattered, you need to understand where firefights actually happened in Vietnam. The jungle combat environment of Southeast Asia created engagement ranges that were radically different from conventional warfare. SLA Marshall's combat analysis documented a specific problem. Under the stress of sudden contact at close range, American soldiers consistently fired high. In one documented incident, a platoon opened fire on approaching NVA at 25 meters, and the M60 machine gunner's bullet stream was about 10 meters high. The gunner was aiming at chest level and hitting treetops. This was not incompetence. It was the predictable effect of adrenaline and sudden contact on human physiology. A rifle requires precise aim to hit a man-sized target. In thick vegetation, at ranges under 20 yards, with a quarter second to react, precise aim becomes nearly impossible. Therefore, a weapon that required less precise aim while delivering greater terminal effect had a decisive advantage. The Australian Army Journal analysed ambush engagements and found that over half occurred at 15 meters or less. Chief Watson specified that 20 yards would be considered long range for the close quarters fights where he carried his Ithaca. British studies from the Malayan emergency found that the shotgun had a hit probability 45% greater than a submachine gun firing 5-round bursts, and twice that of an assault rifle in jungle conditions. The numbers explain why. A standard military buckshot round contains 9 pellets, each 0.33 inches in diameter. At the muzzle, those 9 pellets are traveling at approximately 1,200 feet per second in a tight cluster. At contact range to 5 feet, they haven't begun to spread yet. All 9 pellets strike within an area the size of a quarter. At 5 to 15 feet, the pellets are beginning to separate but still impact within a few inches of each other. At 7 to 25 yards, all 9 pellets will typically strike within a torso-sized target, each acting as an independent wound-producing projectile. Therefore, at the ranges where jungle ambushes actually occurred, a shotgun's spreading pattern of 9 projectiles compensated for exactly the kind of stress-induced aiming error that Marshall documented. But the Ithaca 37's combat effectiveness wasn't just about shot pattern. It was about a second design feature that made the weapon uniquely suited to Vietnam's environment. Every other pump shotgun in Vietnam ejected spent shells through a port on the right side of the receiver. The Remington 870 had a right-side ejection port. The Winchester 1200 had a right-side ejection port. The Stevens 77E had a right-side ejection port. The Ithaca 37 had no side port at all. Both loading and ejection occurred through a single opening on the bottom of the receiver. The sealed sides meant the internal mechanism was substantially protected from Vietnam's environment. This was called bottom ejection, and it was unique among Vietnam-era combat shotguns. The system worked through a double-fingered shell carrier. On the rearward pump stroke, the bolt extracted the spent hull, and the carrier stripped it downward and out through the bottom port, while a fresh round was simultaneously released from the magazine tube onto the carrier. On the forward stroke, the carrier pivoted the new shell upward for the bolt to push into the chamber. Chief Watson wrote that he could dip his shotgun into a muddy Mekong Delta creek, wash it out, and it would function perfectly. He contrasted this directly with the Remington 7188 full-auto shotgun, which he called finicky and fragile. The bottom ejection also made the weapon fully ambidextrous, with no hot brass flying across a left-handed shooter's face. Spent hulls dropped at the shooter's feet rather than bouncing off cover or hitting adjacent teammates. The receiver was machined from a solid steel billet, not stamped or cast. The barrel was cold hammer forged, At 6.3 pounds unloaded, the gun was a full pound lighter than the Remington 870 and noticeably lighter than the Stevens 77E. That pound mattered when carrying a weapon through triple canopy jungle for days. Therefore, the Ithaca combined reliability, ambidextrous operation and lightweight in a single package. But there was a third feature that made certain Ithaca 37s unlike any other shotgun in the American arsenal. An experimental device that turned buckshot into something different. Something worse. The official name was shot diverter. The men who used it called it the duckbill. It was a steel sleeve that attached to the muzzle of an Ithaca 37 and transformed the shotgun's circular shot pattern into a wide horizontal ellipse. Physically, it looked exactly like its name suggested. A cylindrical attachment with long V-shaped notches cut on opposite sides, the top and bottom compressed inward at the muzzle to create a flattened oval opening that resembled a duck's bill. The device was developed at Frankford Arsenal in Philadelphia by an ordnance engineer named Charles A. Greenwood, known within the arsenal as Shotgun Charlie. Production units were manufactured at the Naval Weapons Center at China Lake, California, and later at Crane Weapons Station in Indiana, primarily for SEAL team use. The pattern modification was dramatic. Field testing with No. 4 buckshot produced a pattern 5 feet high by 12 feet wide at 30 meters. At closer ranges 12 yards, the pattern measured approximately 3 feet wide by 16 inches high. Think about what that means in practical terms. A standard cylinder bore shotgun throws a roughly circular pattern. The pellets spread evenly in all directions. Therefore, about half your shot goes above the target's head and below the target's feet. The duckbill eliminated that vertical spread and concentrated all the pellets into a horizontal line at roughly waist height. On a jungle trail, it created a wall of lead. The device worked best with smaller buckshot. No. 4 buck contains 27 pellets per shell, compared to 9 pellets in double aught buck. Those 27 pellets distributed effectively across the widened pattern. Double aught buck's 9 larger pellets were too few to maintain useful pattern density at wider spreads. But there were problems. The first-generation duckbills were manufactured from low-carbon steel using a side milling cutter that created stress concentrations. Under repeated firing, the bills would crack and slowly spread open. A reinforcing ring was added to later versions, which improved durability but slightly degraded the spreading effect. Slugs could not be fired through a duckbill-equipped barrel under any circumstances. The device was permanently silver soldered onto the muzzle, not a removable accessory. Therefore, a duckbill-equipped Ithaca was committed to buckshot only. Combat effectiveness drew mixed assessments. Watson found it highly effective with No. 4 buckshot against targets in the Mekong Delta's dense vegetation. Other operators were less enthusiastic. Some Marines felt the device was better suited for riot duty than combat. Bruce Canfield's assessment in American Rifleman concluded that the results of combat use of the choke were mixed. Distribution was extremely limited, primarily Navy SEAL Teams 1 and 2, UDT, and some USMC reconnaissance units. Supply was chronically short. SEALs couldn't get enough of the modified guns from the lab and were forced to use some standard Navy issue 5-shot guns. The duckbill-equipped Ithacas were withdrawn from service when the last SEAL team departed Vietnam in 1971. But the device represented something important about the Ithaca 37's role in Vietnam. It was a weapon that units modified, customized, and adapted for the specific combat environment they faced. The duckbill was the most extreme example, but the real story of the Ithaca 37 in Vietnam is the story of who carried it and why. The point man occupied the most dangerous position in any patrol, 5 to 10 meters ahead of the column, alone, responsible for detecting ambushes, booby traps, and enemy positions before the rest of the squad walked into them. His survival depended on reacting faster than the enemy in the first fraction of a second of contact. The shotgun was the ideal point weapon for a simple reason. At the ranges where jungle contact occurred, it required less precise aim than any rifle, while delivering catastrophically greater terminal effect. The doctrine for reacting to contact was brutally direct. Fire immediately in the direction of the threat, then continue firing while the squad behind deployed into a fighting formation. With slam fire, the point man could deliver all 5 to 8 rounds in the direction of the enemy within 2 seconds. each round throwing a pattern of buckshot that widened with distance, creating a momentary storm of lead that either killed the ambushers or suppressed them long enough for the squad to react. Ammunition was carried in improvised arrangements. The standard M1938 shotgun shell pouch held only 12 rounds and was reportedly seldom used. Most soldiers stuffed shells into M16 magazine pouches or their pockets. US RV Regulation 735-28 specified 50 rounds per shotgun for patrol operations. Early paper-hulled shells swelled in Vietnam's humidity and caused jamming. The shift to plastic-cased XM162 double-aught buck rounds largely solved this problem. There was also XM257 No. 4 buckshot, but a 1967 to 1968 evaluation across 12 Army units judged it ineffective in combat, lacking the penetration and terminal performance of double-aught buck. Therefore, double-aught buck became the standard combat load. But what did that round actually do when it hit a human being at 15 feet? Standard military double-aught buckshot contains 9 pellets, each 0.33 inches in diameter, traveling at approximately 1,200 feet per second at the muzzle. Each individual pellet carries energy roughly equivalent to a .32 ACP or .380 ACP pistol round. Being struck by a single blast of double-aught buckshot at close range is the ballistic equivalent of being hit by 9 pistol rounds simultaneously. Combined muzzle energy exceeds 1,690 foot-pounds. At contact range to 5 feet, the shot column has not yet begun to spread. All 9 pellets strike within an area the size of a quarter, effectively acting as a single massive projectile that produces catastrophic tissue destruction. A ragged entry wound with wound edge scalloping, surrounded by soot and powder burns. At 5 to 15 feet, the range at which most tunnel, bunker, and ambush engagements occurred, the pellets are beginning to separate but still impact within a few inches of each other, creating multiple parallel wound tracks through the body. Each .33 caliber soft lead pellet deforms on impact, expanding beyond its original diameter and creating wound channels larger than the pellet size would suggest. Penetration in ballistic gelatin measures approximately 14 inches. That exceeds the FBI's 12-inch minimum standard for adequate terminal effect. The US Army's threshold for casualty-producing energy is 58 foot-pounds, based on the standard fragmentation model. Each individual pellet at these ranges exceeds that threshold by a substantial margin. The sound signature contributed to the psychological impact. A standard riot-length barrel produced approximately 156 to 161 decibels, well above the 140 decibel threshold for instant hearing damage. Unlike the sharp supersonic crack of rifle fire, buckshot pellets traveled below the speed of sound, producing only muzzle blast, a deep, concussive boom physically felt in the chest by anyone nearby. In enclosed spaces, bunkers during the Tet Offensive street fighting, the overpressure wave was punishing to the shooter himself, causing temporary deafness and disorientation. Chief Watson's description of the weapon's effect against Viet Cong fighters was delivered with the dark humor common among SEALs. I heard no complaints from any of them, but there are documented cases where we know exactly what happened when men used Ithaca 37s in combat. Chief James Patches Watson was a founding plank owner of SEAL Team 2. He invariably took the point position on behind-the-lines missions even after promotion to chief. His modifications transformed his standard riot gun into something personal. Frankfurt Arsenal extended the magazine to 7 rounds, 8 total with 1 chambered. The barrel was fitted with a duckbill choke. Watson cut the stock down to a bare pistol grip with a homemade single-point sling. He loaded exclusively with No. 4 buckshot for its 27 pellet count combined with the duckbill's horizontal spread. He named the gun Sweetheart. He carried it across 3 combat tours in the Mekong Delta. Watson earned 16 combat decorations, including 4 Bronze Stars with Combat 5, many of them on missions where Sweetheart was his primary weapon. His memoir Point Man documents the weapon's use in classified operations that remained redacted for decades. But Watson wasn't the only man who earned Valor Awards with an Ithaca 37. Sergeant First Class John Anderson was the NCOA of the American Forces Vietnam Network Station in Hue when the Tet Offensive began in 1968. His Silver Star citation documents what happened that night. North Vietnamese soldiers rushed the AFVN compound repeatedly. Anderson held a doorway with a shotgun against repeated assaults through the night. The citation states he was personally responsible for inflicting deadly fire on the attacking enemy force, despite being severely wounded by enemy grenades. The shotgun held the entrance. The NVA never got through. MAC-V SOG recon teams operating deep behind enemy lines in Laos and Cambodia also carried shortened shotguns. Major John Plaster documented that SOG recon skydiver Sammy Hernandez somehow got his hands on a sawed-off Winchester Model 1897, which he strapped aside his body for a night jump into Laos. Another SOG operator carried a sawed-off Browning Auto 5 semi-automatic into Laos. But the semi-auto proved his undoing. It was fast to fire but slow to reload, and he was shot dead while reloading. The incident underscored why many operators preferred the pump action's ability to top off the magazine continuously, one shell at a time, between contacts. Armored crews also adopted shotguns in a role that gave English a new meaning for an old word. Tank and APC crews carried shotguns to ride shotgun on vehicle decks. The gunner perched behind the turret of an M48 Patton or atop an M113, scanning for Viet Cong, attempting to climb aboard with satchel charges and stick grenades. The shotgun's spread pattern and devastating close-range effect made it ideal for this last-ditch defensive role where engagement distances were measured in feet. These are the documented cases: the Silver Stars and Bronze Stars, the SEAL operations and SOG missions. But for every documented case, there were hundreds of point men who carried Ithaca 37s on patrols that never made it into after-action reports. The institutional relationship between the US military and combat shotguns during Vietnam was characterized by profound ambivalence. Nearly 100,000 shotguns were shipped to Southeast Asia. But the weapon never became general issue. It remained a select issue item, typically one per squad, carried by specific men in specific roles. Bruce Canfield's research in American Rifleman documented that units armed with shotguns produced higher body counts than comparable units without them. The data existed at unit level, but no comprehensive kill ratio study was ever published. The closest thing to systematic assessment came from a 1967 to 1968 combat ammunition evaluation across 2,439 shotguns in 12 Army units. The evaluation concluded that flechette rounds showed promise, that number 4 buckshot lacked terminal effectiveness, that double aught buck should remain the standard combat load. But the evaluation didn't address the fundamental question: was the shotgun itself an effective combat weapon in Vietnam? The Army never definitively answered that question. Therefore, the Ithaca 37's role in Vietnam was defined not by institutional doctrine, but by the men who carried it: point men who walked ahead of the patrol, SEALs who operated behind enemy lines, armored crews who defended their vehicles, soldiers who fought in the streets of Hue during Tet. The Ithaca 37 cost $38.11. It weighed 6.3 pounds. It held 5 to 8 rounds depending on configuration. It could empty its magazine in under 2 seconds with slam fire. Its bottom ejection design functioned in mud and rain, and at 15 feet in triple canopy jungle with a quarter second to react, it was the weapon most likely to keep you alive. Chief Watson carried Sweetheart on mission after mission, not because of any institutional endorsement, but because it worked. In the mud, in the rain, in the dark. In the moments where the distance between living and dying was the time it took to pump a shotgun's action and feel it fire. Ithaca removed the slam fire feature around 1975 to 1976, not through adding a disconnector part, but by simply removing the stud from the hammer. The weapon that tens of thousands of men carried in Vietnam was a specific variant that would never be manufactured again. The duckbill chokes were withdrawn when the last SEAL teams left Vietnam in 1971. Most were eventually destroyed or lost. A handful survive in military museums and private collections, but the memory of the Ithaca 37 in Vietnam survives in a different way. In the stories of men like Watson and Anderson, in the after-action reports from SOG missions, in the understated citations that describe holding a doorway against repeated assault or walking point through the Mekong Delta with a weapon named Sweetheart, the Ithaca Model 37 represented a distillation of close combat lethality into a package that weighed barely 6 pounds, a weapon where every design choice, from John Browning's original bottom ejection patent to the absence of a trigger disconnector, aligned with the specific demands of jungle warfare at arm's length. At 20 yards in thick vegetation, it was the weapon most likely to hit what you aimed at. At 15 feet in sudden contact, it was the weapon most likely to end the fight in the first 2 seconds. And in the hands of men who understood its capabilities and limitations, it became one of the most effective close-quarters weapons of the entire war. If you served in Vietnam, leave a comment below about the weapons you carried and the combat situations you faced. These stories matter. The next generation needs to hear them from the men who were there. This is the story of the Ithaca 37 in Vietnam, a pump-action shotgun that could fire like an automatic, a sealed receiver that thrived in monsoon mud, a weapon that the military shipped to Southeast Asia by the tens of thousands but never quite knew what to do with, and the men who carried it into the jungle and came back alive.